Thank you all for being with us, and welcome to the 2021 Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens Memorial Lecture, The Need for More Chris Stevenses. UC Hastings established this lecture series with a generous contribution from the Stevens family to honor the memory, life, and work of Ambassador Stevens, a beloved member of the UC Hastings class of 1989. This series brings distinguished speakers to campus and virtually to discuss law and public policy in an effort to advance global understanding and peace. Ambassador Stevens joined the Foreign Service in 1991. His diplomatic career took him to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Syria, and Libya. Over the course of his career, he gained a reputation as the quintessential diplomat. Ambassador Molly Fee recalled that Chris was an avid student of Islam and the Middle East and consistently strove to build a proverbial bridge between our two cultures in the face of sometimes overwhelming antagonism and bitter misunderstanding. Chris was sworn in as a U.S. ambassador to Libya not long after the Arab Spring of 2011 toppled Muammar Gaddafi. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton noted that as the conflict in Libya unfolded, Chris was one of the first Americans on the ground in Benghazi. He risked his own life to lend the Libyan people a helping hand to build the foundation for a new, free nation. Boubaker Habib, a Libyan contractor who coordinated Ambassador Stevens' September 2012 trip to Benghazi, explained that Chris's mission was to help build a partnership between the United States and the Libyan people and to help rebuild the country. That's what brought him to Benghazi, first as a special envoy in 2011, and then as ambassador in September 2012. He knew the dangers better than anyone else, yet he believed his mission was too important not to carry out to the fullest of his abilities. Michael Ratney, former U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem, recalled how much he learned by reading the daily diplomatic dispatches Chris sent back to Washington while he was stationed in Israel. He said, quote, "I would read about meetings he had in the West Bank, and it was more than just words. You could smell the coffee he was drinking, and you could see the pictures on the wall, and you could feel the furniture. You had a sense of what he was doing. You had a sense of who he was talking to. It was a wonderful skill." Chris's friend, Robin Wright, now a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center, remembers him as the very best of American diplomats who knew the streets as well as the elites. President Barack Obama admired the way in which Chris used his characteristic skill, courage, and resolve to build partnerships with Libyan revolutionaries and to help them as they plan to build a new Libya. President Obama praised him as a role model to all who worked with him and to the young diplomats who aspired to walk in his footsteps. In honoring Chris, President Obama emphasized that our country is only as strong as the character of our people and the service of those, both civilian and military, who represent us around the globe. The American people could hope for no better representative than Chris Stevens. Ambassador Stevens' family has generously provided support for conversations about the people and places Chris cared so deeply about, which we have been privileged to host here at UC Hastings. Thanks to their generosity and to the tremendous admiration and goodwill that the entire diplomatic community holds toward Ambassador Stevens and his remarkable legacy, we have convened dialogues over the years among distinguished experts to discuss a range of issues relating to diplomacy and public policy. Today, we are very fortunate to be able to continue this wonderful series. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's speaker and panel, Professor Shemin Keitner, who will introduce our distinguished guests. Professor Keitner is a leading authority on international law and civil litigation. She's authored 2 books and dozens of articles, essays, and book chapters on questions surrounding the relationship among law, communities, and borders. including, and the historical understandings underpinning current practice in these areas. From 2016 to 2017, Shemin served as the 27th Counselor on International Law in the U.S. Department of State. I now turn the program over to Professor Kite.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you also to the Stevens family for what is truly one of our most meaningful annual campus events. Former Assistant Secretary Doug Wilson has had a 40-year career in foreign policy, national security, politics, and communication strategy that spans the public and private sectors. He served as a U.S. Foreign Service Information Officer in Italy and in the United Kingdom, and as Congressional Director at the U.S. Information Agency. He headed the world's largest government communications operation as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. He was the first openly gay individual to be Senate confirmed for a senior Pentagon position, and he played a key role in the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He is a 3-time recipient of the Pentagon's highest civilian honor, the Distinguished Public Service Award. He also served as the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor on 2 presidential campaigns for Gary Hart and Pete Buttigieg. And he is the co-founder with former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, of the Leaders Project, which over 10 years brought together more than 400 international public and private sector leaders from all parts of the globe and all walks of life on cross-sector topics, including oil and water, health and economics, the Muslim world, India, Russia, women as leaders of change, public diplomacy, and aid and development. So we so much look forward to his remarks, after which we'll have the privilege of commentary and discussion from our 2 distinguished guests. Ambassador Mike McFaul is the Director and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He served for 5 years in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council, then as U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation. He's authored several books, including the New York Times bestseller, From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. He's also an analyst for NBC News and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. And we're delighted to host Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, who's been a steadfast proponent of achieving excellence through diversity in organizations and breaking down barriers for women and minorities. She was the longest serving U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Malta. As Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism, she advised the commander of U.S. cyber forces on foreign policy priorities and expanded counterterrorism programs. As the Secretary of State, Special Assistant for the Middle East and Africa, she monitored the election in the Gaza Strip and supported gender equality in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as the first woman to lead a diplomatic mission there. She's also held senior positions at the Defense Department and the National Security Council. And most recently, she was tapped to rejoin the State Department as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, a newly established post that reports directly to the Secretary of State. Thank you all so much for joining us here today.
Shemin, thank you very much for that introduction. And I want to thank Dean Fegman, Dean Short, and the entire staff at Hastings School, of which my sister is an alumnus, for hosting this event. I'm honored to have been asked to join the ranks of such individuals as Bill Burns and Tamara Kaufman-Wittes to give this lecture. I have many friends and colleagues who are joining tonight to whom I express my deep appreciation. And I particularly want to express my thanks to Mike McFaul and to Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley. Gina, congrats on your new appointment. These are 2 of the most respected professionals in the Foreign Service field, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion in which we will engage after this. I also want to note that about 4 hours ago, President Biden announced that all troops would be withdrawn from Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which would be September 11, and of 2001. We'd been there 20 years. And that, I think, provides a context for the discussion that we will have today about State Department reform, and in particular, what constitutes acceptable risk. for the men and women who constitute our national security civilian workforce, maybe more than any other event of recent weeks could do. I want to start by addressing the Stevens family. Tom, I want to thank you so much for the introduction, and to you and to all of the members of your family. I know that you selected me in part because of the recent article on We Need More Chris Stevens, which was co-authored by two of my Pete Buttigieg foreign policy team colleagues, Alex Pascal and Angelique Young, both of whom are joining us tonight, and published by Tess Bridgman of Just Security. And as we get into this, I want to just give you a couple of additional piece of background information on the person whom you have selected to give this lecture tonight. When I was growing up, I always wanted to be a Foreign Service officer with the dream ultimately of becoming an ambassador. Most of my friends wanted to be doctors or lawyers or business leaders or bankers or engineers or professors. When I went for my first visit outside the United States as a teenager with my parents to Mexico City, the thing I wanted most to do was to have them take me to all the embassies so I could get posters of all the nations. I ultimately did become a Foreign Service officer serving with the U.S. Information Agency. I served in 3 hardship posts, Naples and Rome in Italy and London in the United Kingdom. I met some of the most outstanding professionals I've ever worked with in my life. My mentors were 2 women, Lois Roth at USIA, who was one of the last people to serve at our embassy then in Tehran, and Joanne Lewinson, who was a South Asia specialist, with Len Baldiga, who had served in Poland and played a key role along with others there in the links with Solidarity, which led to the spark that started the fire in Eastern Europe and ultimately in the then Soviet Union. And with Bill Lenderking, who is the father of the man who is now President Biden's special envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking. I left the Foreign Service after 8 years, in part because I thought the higher up you went, the more bureaucratic it became, and in part because I thought that coming to terms with my own sexual orientation meant I could never be an ambassador. But some 15 years later, I returned to the USIA as the congressional director there. The Cold War had ended. There was an emphasis on budget and spending. There was an initiative called Reinventing Government, which focused on spending. And I was involved in leading the fight against the consolidation of the US Information Agency into the State Department, and we lost. I went then to the Pentagon for the first of 3 tours, and I met some of the most outstanding men and women I've ever met, people who'd served in uniform on the battlefield for their country and who had willing to take the ultimate risks and make the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Qualities that have long been recognized by the Congress and the public, and financial resources allotted accordingly to give them everything they needed to do their jobs. Because of this issue of accepting risk, they gradually assumed roles in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the forever wars, the battlefields of this century, that went beyond traditional military roles. And however uncomfortable they might have felt, they were playing roles that those in traditional civilian workforce roles were no longer playing in terms of leading roles and dealing with swing publics. So the military was tasked with jobs that they were not trained for, and civilians were unable to effectively do the jobs that they had been trained for. I left in March of 2012 to go and work for the Obama re-elect, and on September of that year, September 11 of that year, I read with horror, along with millions of Americans, the news from Libya that Chris Stevens and 3 of his colleagues had been killed in Benghazi. I had never met Chris personally, but I knew of him from Foreign Service friends, of his reputation as a cutting edge officer, as an innovative officer, and who's someone who understands the centrality of human engagement. One of the people who worked for me at the Cohen Group, Jared Kaplan, ended up serving in Libya and told me about him. And Jared is one of the outstanding young people now working today in public diplomacy. So let's turn now to the issue of acceptable risk and the blatant politicization of the death of Chris Stevens and three of his colleagues in Benghazi, which I think, and wrote in my piece, has been one of the great travesties of recent diplomatic history. His death revealed long-standing shortcomings in adapting US engagement abroad to the more dynamic and dangerous environments in which civilian foreign policy practitioners must now live and operate. The politicization of his death dramatically reduced Washington's already low risk tolerance levels for civilians serving abroad. And in my view, both of those things severely and adversely affected our ability to recruit and retain a new generation of civilians willing to serve their country abroad. And if I had any doubt in those judgments, those were erased when I read, soon after his death, the letter that Jan Stevens, his father, wrote with regards to the aftermath. And I'd just like to quote Mr. Stevens from your superb letter. Chris died doing what he loved most, working to build bridges of understanding and mutual respect between the people of the United States and the people of the Middle East. He was successful because he embodied the traits that have always endeared America to the world: a commitment to democratic principles and respect for others, regardless of race, religion, or culture. He amazed and impressed people by walking the streets with the lightest of escorts, sitting in sidewalk cafes, chatting with passersby. There was a risk to being acceptable, Jan Stevens wrote. Chris knew it and he accepted it. He would not have wanted to be remembered as a victim. He knew and accepted that he was working under dangerous circumstances. He did so, just as so many of our diplomatic and development professionals do every day, because he believed the work was vitally important. He would have wanted the critical work he was doing, the kind of work that made him literally thousands of friends and admirers across the broad Middle East, to continue. So, how do we recruit and retain and motivate a new generation of Chris Stevens, a new generation of Anne Smeddinghoffs, who also died as a public diplomacy officer under similar circumstances doing her work in Afghanistan? There's a lot of talk right now about State Department reforms, civilian national security workforce reforms in general. Mike McFaul and Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley are among those who are contributing now very significantly to that discussion. I want to offer thoughts, very brief thoughts in three areas. Just a few words on the new communications environment and on public diplomacy before I turn to the issue that I think has been most neglected and is perhaps most important, the issue of acceptable risk. Chris Stevens was a cutting-edge diplomat, and he understood the centrality of human relationships to America's national security interests. He also operated in a vastly different communications environment than his diplomatic predecessors had done even 10 years earlier. And I think he would agree now that the communications environment in which his colleagues now work is even more complicated. We have multiple communication tools: overt, covert, intelligence, social media. And what we have done is we have spent a long time discussing each of them as silos. And we have not spent enough time or given enough thought regarding how to use these tools in tandem, how to play to the combined as well as the individual strengths of each. Social media is an important tool. It is not a substitute for human interactions. Covert and overt communications are important tools. They have too long been the subject of endless discussion about what constitutes strategic communication. We spend too much time talking about definition, not enough time talking about how to achieve the mission. And for those who will be involved in State Department reforms and the reforms of civilian workforce, I encourage them to look at all of these communication elements in concert rather than as zero-sum tools. With regard to public diplomacy, in the early 90s, there were 4 independent policy agencies, foreign policy agencies, at the center of a fierce debate regarding the continuation of their independence. I called them four scorpions in a bottle. The Cold War had ended, at least the post-World War II phase of it. The focus was the peace dividend, and the Clinton administration was under pressure from many sides, not the least being the late North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina, to merge these four into the State Department to achieve savings. Reinventing government, this initiative was also based on achieving savings. As the congressional director then at the U.S. Information Agency, I was right in the middle of this battle. And then Senator John Kerry, who was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, led the fight against consolidation. It ended up being a losing effort. Most of us who were against consolidation listed as the primary reason for independence the need for credibility of the messenger, the need to look not so much at our context, but the context in which foreign publics were hearing and receiving the messages that were being given. And of all the factors that were considered at the time of reinventing government and the end of the Cold War, there was little, if any, thought given to what the mission should be of public diplomacy in this new world. There are many people, including myself, who think the public diplomacy function has been weakened and not strengthened over the last 20 years. But I think as we look at public diplomacy as an element of foreign policy, we need to take a look at what I think the glaring error was and remains. Decisions that are based on things that everything but what the mission should be. In the mid-90s, we should have focused more on what the mission should be and the kinds of people needed to recruit and retain to carry out the mission. There are a lot of people who think that we should resurrect the old U.S. Information Agency, and there are people like former Defense Secretary Bob Gates who think we need a USAA on steroids. In my view, before we think about the structure, though, we need to think about the mission. What should that mission be in terms of the human interaction that public diplomacy practitioners specialize in? What are the most effective ways now for them to accomplish their mission in a variety of different formats and environments around the world? How do they get the tools and the respect, not only of the American public, but of those who work in the State Department in other areas necessary to do their jobs and to do it credibly? Now I want to turn to the issue of acceptable risk. And I want to start with a quote from Ryan Crocker, one of the most able diplomats ever to serve this country, who said, "In this world, you cannot do effective American diplomacy in places where it's most needed unless you take some risks. Sadly, this happened on my watch. I lost an officer in Pakistan, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. You cannot do effective diplomacy if eliminating risk is your top priority, if it's all about protecting the people who are out there and ensuring that nobody gets hurt. You're not going to be doing effective diplomacy then. You've got to be ready to run some risk. You can't sacrifice diplomacy to a zero-sum mentality. We cripple ourselves by doing it. It's absurd. It's no way for a great power to do business." Several years ago, I led an effort with Catherine Brown, who was the executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, to try to talk to stakeholders across the board about what it means to have acceptable risk for those who are working in conflict zones, in frontline states, and in fact, in places that really, you could say any place in the world now have more dangers to American diplomats than they did before. Our effort included help from the John McCain Institute, from the Truman National Security Project, and from the U.S. Institute of Peace. We talked to stakeholders across the board, as I say, current diplomats, those who'd already served, junior diplomats, people who worked in NGOs, people who worked in security, people who worked in intelligence, people who worked in the military, and people who worked on Capitol Hill, senior staffers and junior staffers, Democrats and Republicans from the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs committees of the House and the Senate. Here's what we found. Women and men who want to serve the United States abroad in civilian clothing, an increasing number of whom, by the way, are first-generation Americans now, don't do it for the money. They're motivated by patriotism and ethos of service, just like their military counterparts. They're also very realistic about how best to make a difference and how they can use their talents. They just want the training and support and the freedom and respect from the public to make a difference in the world while they're doing their jobs. For those who are listening tonight who don't know the scope of civilians serving their country abroad, there are people who are serving to help American workers compete on a fair playing field, to help open new markets for American businesses, to collect intelligence, to keep Americans safe, to defend human rights and cherished American values, to help communities abroad design and implement local development projects, and to promote understanding of US policies by trying to correct misperceptions about the US and to help us obtain the benefit of the doubt. They're ready and eager to try new programs, pilot new ideas, develop new approaches. But the transformed overseas environments in which they work has resulted in a range of risks that has grown dramatically since the beginning of the 20th century. These stakeholders made the following points. They don't want to make a zero-sum choice between risk and mission. They want to be able to do their jobs. Everything that we learned over the course of several months was put into a nutshell by one AID worker. There are some fantastic people working for USAID who said this. A lot of what we were told when we went out or when we couldn't go out was if you get hurt, you affect the entire mission. If a few people get hurt in a very high-risk environment, it has a big impact in Washington. All the security measures then go into overdrive. Everyone gets locked down. That affects your ability to get out and be effective. The only way you can be effective is by engaging and by building relationships. And this affects who you can attract when you talk about recruiting a new generation for public service. If you lock everyone down, you create the wrong incentives for recruiting the people that you want, and you drive out the people that you need. You can say the best way to protect individuals from physical risk is to lock them down, but then you negate the greater reason why you're there, and you put the overall mission at greater risk. The issue, they said, is not risk elimination, but risk tolerance and risk management. They are willing to accept risk if they are informed about the risk environment. They want the channels necessary, not just the security people at the mission, but the publics with whom they engage who are most informed about the security situation in their areas. This can mean local mayors, local governors, local business people, opposition leaders, religious leaders, even in some places, militia members and tribal members. They believe that the professionals who are in the field, ambassadors and leaders in the field, need to be more empowered up and down the chain to take informed risks and make more decisions on the ground. They worry that we're becoming so risk averse that we're creating not just mistrust, but a deep chasm. Angelique Young told me about conversations that she was required to have outside the mission with people who were considered to be members of swing publics in those countries. Very sensitive conversations with security personnel from the embassy standing right next to her. They wonder why the military gets the respect and support they need and of course deserve, but civilians who are in the same kinds of places now, in the Somalias, in the Yemens, in Afghanistan and Iraq, why those people who are in frontline states don't get the same. They also feel that the hardest rocks to push uphill are with Congress and with the public. That when people see a Benghazi, they don't look at how do you empower our civilians and give them the resources and think about the kinds of tools they need to do their jobs, but instead think about never again will this happen. We need to build higher embassy walls and put more barbed wire. So to those who are going to be looking at the reform in the State Department and other foreign policy agencies, and how to recruit and retain a new generation of Chris Stevens and Ann Smedinghoffs. Here are some of the questions that need to be asked, for which there are no answers yet, because we haven't asked the questions. What constitutes an acceptable level of risk for the civilian workforce? How do we balance mission and risk so it's not a zero-sum choice? And what do we consider to be the tipping points? What tools, resources, and training do we need to give to our civilian workforce to minimize risk without undermining the basic goals of engagement? What public engagement lessons can we learn from the military's dealings with civil societies during the forever wars, and from NGOs that can operate more effectively at grassroots levels and do not want to be given the responsibility of representing the government because that's not the job in which they are in? And what post-development resources and support are needed to help US civilians recover from the physical and psychological wounds of frontline service? To do this, I believe we need a holistic approach involving all stakeholders, not just those in government, but those who work in NGOs, those who've served in the military and national security positions before, those involved in intelligence and security professions, and those involved in Congress. And one of the things that we found most interesting was that despite the divide and politicization that we are now dealing with, there was virtual unanimity among Republican and Democratic staff on the Hill that such a study was necessary, and that it was necessary to help to change the behavior in both Congress and among the public about what happens in the blowback when civilians accept risk. In conclusion, I just want to say this. A new generation was drawn to national security and public service in the aftermath of 9/11. And 20 years later, particularly in the aftermath of the last 4 years and damage that has been done, in my view, to our national security institutions and workforce, we have to counter cynicism among younger, diverse constituencies about America's role in the world. Like Chris Stevens before them, last year, Masha Jovanovic and Bill Taylor and others showed America the quality and courage of the civilian national security workforce. We now need a renewed spirit of service that brings Americans from all backgrounds and all walks of life into national security service. But this is only going to be possible if they're empowered and prepared and supported in and rewarded for their willingness to take risks on behalf of the American people. The failure to do so ignores the real lessons of the untimely deaths of public servants like Chris Stevens and Ann Smedinghoff. And that, in my view, poses what is in fact truly unacceptable risk to our long-term national security interests. To the Stevens family, let me conclude by saying this. The legacy of your son and your brother is being recognized in many productive ways, including the Stevens Initiative, for which a new program has just been announced in the last week on video game exchange to foster connections between young people in the US and the Middle East and North Africa. The spirit of Chris Stevens' life, and Jan, the spirit of your letter, we need to do more to make sure there are more Chris Stevens with the tools they need to accomplish their mission. Your invitation has been one of the great honors of my life. Your son was one of the great public servants. We need more of him, more men and women like him. And we need to give them the tools they need to accomplish their mission. And we don't have answers to the questions now because we've never asked the questions. So I hope all stakeholders are going to be involved to do that. And I hope all of us will be part of that. And with that, I want to turn to two individuals who have spent their careers in public service and have done fantastic work. Mike McFaul, as ambassador to Russia, understands risk because he was someone who dealt with that every day on the streets of Moscow and in the embassy in dealing with opposition groups and members of the public who were not necessarily approved by the government. Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, the former ambassador to Malta, was the first woman to head a U.S. mission in Saudi Arabia. She also was the person who led the evacuation of that mission during an al-Qaeda attack. Both of you understand what it means to risk, to accept risk in doing your job. So I guess I'd like to, let me do this. Let me start with you, Mike, and then turn to Gina to ask you about your thoughts on acceptable risk and how best to deal with it.
Well, first, it's a great honor for me to be here too. Doug, fantastic remarks. Congratulations. I have so many questions for you. Maybe I get to ask you some questions too, particularly about USAIA. These are reforms I'm thinking about myself. As you know, we've exchanged emails about them. And I just want to say it is also a real honor and privilege for me to be here to celebrate Ambassador Stevens. I met him once. I used to work at the National Security Council for 3 years. Alex Pascal, if you're out there, hello. Alex and I worked together there. And most of you will not know this. So I've spent most of my time in academia, and most of my writing, in fact, is about transitions from authoritarian rule. I think publicly I'm known mostly as a Russia person, but that's what I teach about here and written about here at Stanford. And in 2011, as Alex will remember, I actually spent quite a bit of time working on the Arab Spring because we had lots of specialists on different countries. We didn't have specialists that thought about transitions from authoritarian rule. And that's when I met Chris. It was just in the hallway. He was our special representative. I think he may have been on his way out before he was named ambassador. He was in to see my colleague Dan Shapiro and Puneet Talwar and Dennis Ross. They were all working on this issue, and I was kind of invited in to be part of the debate about the Arab Spring. And I want to just remind you about 2011 before we get to 2012 and your question, Doug. 2011 for many people was a very euphoric moment. If you believed in the ability for countries to change and move from autocracies to democracies, we now know the history, obviously, tragically, what happened later in Libya, what happened later in Syria, what happened later in Egypt. But 2011 was a pretty optimistic time, at least working at the National Security Council, where I did. And Chris, I remember them all saying, we found the perfect person to take advantage of this most fantastic euphoric moment because of his deep knowledge of the country, but his deep enthusiasm for engaging with the people. Because this was a moment of people power, after all. This was not a moment of the autocrats. And I remember that very vividly because I, at the time in 2011, was preparing to go out to Moscow, different circumstances, but to try to bridge the gap, as Doug, you've been talking about, between doing your government to government interaction, but also being engaged with the society where you're serving. When I went to see Secretary Clinton for my last meeting before flying out to Moscow, she said two things to me. One was, be tough. We're in for a tough road with these guys, and she was way beyond. She was way ahead of, I think, the curve in understanding that regarding the government. But she also said to me very bluntly, she said, "You're not going to Moscow just to deal with Lavrov. You're going to Moscow to represent America, not just the Obama administration, to the Russian people." And she was very explicit about that. And she even told me, I remember, she said, "You got to get on Twitter, Mike." I live in the Silicon Valley. I've been here for most of my life. Twitter used to be just down the road. I know these companies. I know thousands of people that work them. I'd never seen a Twitter account before she told me I had to do that. And then I met her social media advisor, a guy named Alec Ross, who gave me my first tutorial on using Twitter as another modality for reaching out to people. Doug, you said something very important. You need to do both at the same time, right? I had a rule that no digital interaction during working hours. Physical interaction had to be paramount. It was only before I went to work and after I went to work that I did the digital part. But I was pretty aggressive in engaging with the Russian people and engaging with Russian opposition. I was obeying my boss, after all. I switched bosses, right? I went from Obama to Clinton. They were both my bosses, of course. It was a pretty volatile time in Russia, just to remind you all. There were massive demonstrations after a falsified election in December 2011, sparking the same kinds of demonstrations you had throughout the Arab world. And we were trying to delicately engage with the government, but also engage with society. And the Russian government didn't want us to do that. And so I did encounter, well before the tragic events of September 11th later that year, I arrived in Moscow in January 2012, and we dealt with both harassment, but also physical threats and, very serious threats. And the goal was always, in our assessment or our threat assessment, just to echo some of the things you said, Doug, the goal was to end that kind of activity, right? The goal was, so I remember very vividly one of the first trips I took as an ambassador to a town called Ekaterinburg. And I was on Twitter and I had this idea, Facebook, lots of platforms. And I said, rather than just letting our consulate out in Ekaterinburg invite people to a Meet the Ambassador event, I had the new brilliant idea, well, let's just invite anybody. And I did that on platforms, and we had an explosion of interest, but that meant an explosion of threat that we had to deal with. And my RSO, Regional Security Officer, was not very thrilled with that idea. And how do you navigate that? We ended up bringing in enhanced security and metal detectors and all kinds of things like that, just to do a simple meet with the ambassador. And I don't have a solution to your question, right? Other than to say the spirit of your remarks, I think, are what we need to wrestle with, which is to go in the opposite direction. The fortresses that we have built around the world as our embassies, we literally, after the assassination of Ambassador Stevens and his three US government officials, the next day, Doug, I remember it very vividly, at our country team meeting, we had a debate about building the walls of our embassy higher, to echo something you said in your remarks, because they were not high enough to protect us. And we had a debate about whether we could have these kind of open events again, given the threat that was there. And again, I don't think there's a silver bullet, but we have to find the right mix, because the power of engaging society and bringing America to societies, right? That's what we do in public diplomacy. That's where some of the best things I did as ambassador. I love those events. Those were fantastic events. I'm from Montana, right? Bringing a country western band from Montana where we dance the two-step, that is reaching Russians, folks, better than any démarche that I could do with the deputy foreign minister. And yet that comes with increased risk. We just have to try to get that balance right, because in the long run, that public diplomacy piece that you were talking about, I think that is our greatest strength when we deal with the Russias and the Chinas of the world. And to take that off of the field and say we're not going to do that because it's too risky, I think would be a really big strategic mistake.
Mike, thank you. And Gina, I'm going to turn to you. I just want to say one thing, though, Mike, about because you are now very active on Twitter, and you are a pioneer in doing that. And I want to compliment you, because at the beginning, I think the State Department found Twitter to be just this really amazing, neat, exciting tool. And the focus for too long was, how many followers do I have? We're getting like millions of followers. And you were one, and I hope that this continues, where the focus ought to be on listening. Who are they? What are they saying? I mean, when you take away some of the white noise, or a lot of the white noise, you're reaching people for whom cell phones has been, jumping over the technology of hard lines because they didn't have time to install it. There was no time to build that infrastructure. So listening that way is, I think, way more important than how many followers do you have. Gina, you served in Saudi Arabia, so you've served on counterterrorism. And I'm curious your thoughts about dealing with risk.
Thank you. Well, I too want to say thank you to Chris's family for this gathering this evening, the ability to discuss these issues, and to remember Chris. We crossed paths through our careers, mostly in the Middle East. And the last several times that I saw him was in the hallway of the department, because I got confirmed 1 week before he did. But in that month up, waiting for that vote from the Senate, we'd see each other. What are you hearing? What are you hearing? And so the thumbs up that we were both giving each other, knowing that we were heading out to post. Again, your questions are so important and so difficult. After surviving a terrorist attack in Saudi Arabia and thinking through how we balance getting back to work, opening up again, and as you say, keeping people safe. And the reality is, as you get this long list from the President of the United States that outlines what your responsibilities are, what he, hopefully she soon, will lay out is important to accomplish as the President's representative, the first thing out there, the thing that we are told is most important, is keeping people safe. And I don't know how you get around that. But at the same time, if you focus only on that, as you've both said very clearly, you cannot accomplish the mission of engagement, of making the case. And the reality is, you can't attract the best people who are willing to engage overseas, who want to understand different cultures and politics and make the case for America, because that's our job. They are not people who want to stay behind walls. They are not people who want to stay behind walls, to be constrained from those people-to-people engagement. So you're absolutely right. Social media cannot do it. You've got to have both, because there is a point for social media. But if we want to get the best and brightest and wonderful representatives of the United States, we're going to have to find that balance. In the end, I worked on the Truman Report. We did a report on reforming the Department of State. And of all the issues that people were laying out that made them feel constrained or undervalued, undersupported, risk was never mentioned. That wasn't an issue. People weren't saying, lock me down, keep me safer, build a higher wall, more security to take me wherever I want to go. So that isn't the main issue. Making sure that people's abilities, people's potential are met, people's perspectives, willing to engagement, to share different aspects of what it means to be an American, of what it means to represent the United States. Those are the things that people are looking for. So again, we're going to have to find that balance. And as you said, Mike, if we're going to bring in the best resources, attract the best people, it's not going to be behind walls. Cannot be.
You're absolutely right, Gina. And it was interesting because in the work that Catherine and I did on acceptable risk, we found this interesting conundrum. Some of the most effective representation of the United States in terms of interacting with what I call swing publics. Swing publics are not the Al-Qaedas, they're the Sistanis of the world, is being done by NGOs.
Yes.
People in NGOs they're doing the kind of job getting the kind of results that all of us would like to share and know about. But they don't want to go into government because of the constraints that you mentioned, and they don't want to be asked to do the government's work. What we need to do is figure out a way where we're able to recruit and retain those kind of people in government by giving them the tools they need to do their jobs, understanding that there is a balance, It's not a zero-sum choice. And to me, what lies before us is the fact that these questions have never been asked before. The fact that this is very difficult, there's no question about it, particularly after the last 4 years, when I think the challenges to American credibility in a variety of ways are greater than they've been in a long time. We have a lot to build back. But we need to look at this at the perspective of those from whom we want the benefit of the doubt. Our messengers need to be credible, and we need to give some thought as to how to do that. You just spoke, Gina, about the work that the Truman National Security Project has just done with regard to State Department reform, and I'm going to come back to you for some more specifics. They've done some great work on a variety of these issues, including frontline states with work that Angelique Young and Becky Zimmerman have done over the past several years. But Mike, I know that you're working on a book on this, and I just wondered if in a couple of minutes you could give us a sneak preview of some of the key points that, based on your experience, you'll be recommending.
Well, Doug, I'm writing a book about great power competition in the 21st century and lessons from the Cold War for how we can engage. And I can't summarize that in a couple of minutes, and you don't want me to try. But stay tuned. But a couple of things, and it's related to this. The end of the book is about recommendations and how we do better in lots of spaces, how we do better in strategic communications that you mentioned in your remarks, how we do better with diplomacy. I have a whole section on how State Department reform, including a brand new org chart that I even published, and how we do better at democracy promotion or supporting democratic ideas around the world. A couple of things I would say just to keep the conversation going. Number one, I do think, as that you were alluding to, we got out of the habit of talking about ideas. After the end of the Cold War, we thought everybody was going to join us, and the whole world wanted to be democratic, right? And we're moving towards us. My colleague Frank Fukuyama wrote a very famous article called "The End of History," and we closed down USIE, as you know well, because we thought that this battle was over. This battle is not over, in my view, and I think we have to get smarter about how we do it. I, for instance, when I was the ambassador, and remember, I want to keep emphasizing, I was a political appointee, everyone. So I was not an experienced ambassador, but I am pretty experienced at speaking in front of, hundreds of young people. That's what I do for a living. I speak on TV, I'm speaking right now. And when I got to the embassy, I met the public affairs team, Doug, and, they were a really talented team. Most of them were Russian, by the way. But they were a small part of our team compared to the 1,500 people at the embassy. And I wondered, why isn't everybody a public affairs officer? Why doesn't everybody spend as much time thinking about how to communicate what they're doing to Russians as they are thinking about how to communicate to their desk officers back in Washington? And for those of you who don't know, an embassy in Moscow, in Russia has 24 agencies there, right? The State Department's just one of two. I think we're 27, 28. I mean, we had commerce, we had agriculture, NASA, FBI, many other acronyms you might imagine would be in Moscow. And so one day, Doug, I went into country team meeting and I said, I hereby declare that everybody at this meeting you've been deputized as a public affairs officer now. I gave one exception. That was to our chief of station, the head of the CIA. I said, that individual, he doesn't have to participate in this. But the head of the FBI, I said, you do. And you've got to figure out a way for us to communicate what we're doing here. Because remember, I was in Putin's Russia, right? Putin was spending hundreds of millions of dollars abroad and billions of dollars internally to tell his story about America. We had to project our story about what we were doing. So that did not go down lightly, by the way. Some people embraced it, others didn't. My dad, the general that ran the the head of the defense attaché that was there, he loved it, by the way, and really got into it. Used a lot of, we were there with a lot of World War II anniversaries coming up. General Zwack is his name, Peter Zwack. You might, if you ever come across him, really leaned into the assignment. By the way, his special assistant at the time was a young gentleman called Alexander Vindman. You've heard a lot about Alex lately. And he really embraced it. And it was fantastic that he thought of his job not being outside of the box. But the difficulty, and Doug, I think you're alluding to it in your remarks, you know better than I do, and others on this call know much more than I do. the incentives are not there for foreign service officers to do that. The incentives are to write beautiful cables, and they do, by the way, fantastic cables. But there's little incentives to go to a high school, to go do a public talk, and that structure, I think, has to be radically rethought about in terms of State Department reform. And then another bigger thing, we'll come back to it if you want, but I think we have to blow up USAMG. This is the entity where Voice of America is, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, the Open Technology Fund, run by a former student of mine, by the way. We got to rethink it. And we got to, in my view, for those parts of VOA, let's just take Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which I know the best, that works, in the part of the world that I know the best. We need more separation between Radio Liberty and the US government. I want it to be spun off and privatized and let the money come directly from the US Congress, right? I want a giant firewall between them and Voice of America and the State Department. And at the same time, this may sound counterintuitive, I want the State Department and the undersecretary there responsible for public diplomacy to have way more resources and move some of those assets that are somewhere in between with this really ill-defined mission. VOA is a confused organization. I know the organization pretty well. On the one hand, they act like journalists, and on the other hand, they're supposed to explain America. And on the third hand, they're supposed to explain American foreign policy. That you can't do all three of those things. So I would like to see us break that up. It's a different model than USIA. I don't want to get into the weeds here, and Doug, you know this better than I do, but I do think we need to radically rethink that space. Most certainly the Russians have, most certainly the Chinese have. I think we need to as well.
Mike, I'm going to turn to Gina next, because I hope you will talk a little bit about some of the key findings and recommendations out of Truman. And I also want to ask you a question about your new job, not so much the job, but the mission you have in it. Mike, I want to make two comments about what you just said. You and others who are in the Career Foreign Service, and Chris Stevens was the outstanding example of this, understand communication. Chris understood communication, and that's what he loved, and that's what he did. And he understood swing publics. He understood that you're dealing with often hostile publics, not ones who are necessarily out to kill you, but ones from whom you need some trust and some credibility, even if they're not going to agree with you on all points. And so that raises the question, when you talk about everybody in the Foreign Service being a public diplomacy officer. To me, I think you also need to look at those who are public diplomacy officers, who have the skill sets necessary to engage. And the question I believe you need to ask about public diplomacy is what are the new skill sets that they need in order to engage in these new environments where, our arts and our music have been traditional emblems of aspiration and attachment, our achievements educationally, our achievements scientifically, and up until I think recently, our commitment to democracy and to values has been something that has been at the forefront. But how do you enable people to have the credibility as messengers? Because some of those swing publics are not necessarily going to be sympathetic to those who are official government workers conveying these messages. With regard to broadcasting, you make some excellent points. I remember working with then Senator Biden, who is passionate about the quality of our radios abroad as an effective tool. I believe the radios were also caught up in this is the end of the Cold War. We need now to talk about savings, and we didn't look at mission. I think in looking at the radios remain key tools. How they operate and what they do to be most credible are things we need to ask, and we need to ask those who've been working with them for a long time to be part of that discussion. Gina, can you talk a little bit more about the work that you've just concluded with some of your colleagues on what Truman is recommending? And then I want to ask you a question with regards to diversity.
Okay, well, let me think about this, because when I worked with that report, I was a private citizen. And so there are.
What can you say that's safe now?
Yeah, better be careful there, Ambassador.
Indeed, I'm thinking it through here. What I will say is that I personally, stand behind many of the recommendations that the report made, but mostly what it was pulling out with regard to how you attract the best and the brightest and how you support them throughout their careers, that ability to reach their full potential. There are a number of recommendations with regard to increasing diversity and inclusion, and that was the portion that I focused on, as you can imagine, as well as some of the other challenges with regard to making public-private partnerships, making connections with the American people so that people in not only big cities that are used to dealing with international projects or issues, but in smaller towns and cities in America to understand that American diplomats are working for all Americans. There's this poster that every diplomat gets and every ambassador gets before they go out, and it's got a number for the number of jobs that the country that we are going to be representing the United States to, what that trade relationship or that business relationship, how many American jobs it generates, how much money for the state are tied to doing business with that country. Well, that kind of information can be very helpful. So that's one of the recommendations, to really build up a coterie of diplomats who can make that case. Whether it's science diplomacy, climate change diplomacy, all of these international issues, while in the bailiwick of the Department of State, those impacts, as we all know, based on weather, based on impacts from climate change, affect Americans at home in the States across the country. So making sure that we can bring in people who might have very specialized knowledge that might be helpful for negotiating, might be helpful for backgrounding, to really get sorts of agreements that we need to get in an informed fashion. But as I said, most of what I focused on was how we get and keep America's representatives looking like America. And as I've said many times publicly, and no doubt I'll be saying in my official capacity, we've been talking about this for 30 years and we've done a very poor job of it. And we have such incredible talent in this country, in the Department of State. By gum, if we put our minds to it, we can resolve this issue. We can solve it. We can be the leader, be the model, frankly, for other foreign ministries, for other government agencies, for the private sector. I think the Department of State has the ability to do that. We just have to decide that's what we're going to do. And we did a lot of talking, but we didn't actually really focus our attention on, okay, we know we have a problem, let's take care of it. So I think we're going to be able to do that. And I believe the Truman Report does have some incredibly useful recommendations. One, that to be fair and honest, many other reports that have come out recently have also echoed, and that is the need to have the data, And I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but what I'm going to say now is that a change that we're making at the Department of State, based on the Secretary's comments day before yesterday, is that as we look at this, we're going to move from protecting the Department of State to improving the Department of State. And so we've obfuscated the numbers. I mean, when we get a hard look at and share with the world the numbers and who's where and how small or how large, I'm certain it's going to be shocking. And we need to take that hard look at it in order to improve it. We can't fix what we can't see. So we're going to take a look at it. We're going to be honest about it. We're going to be transparent about it so people understand why we have to make the changes we need to make. And it's for everybody, because when you're clamping down, it doesn't matter what your background is, your gender, your sexual orientation. Everyone is harmed if we don't have the right people,
Well, I have to say there's two comments I want to make. First, with that last one, I read a fantastic comment of yours that said you used to go into meeting after meeting at the State Department. None of the people who should have been at the table were there, which is something that I profoundly echo based on my own experience in government. I want to say, though, before I want to pursue this with regard to the diversity and inclusion issue. But with regards to the importance of foreign policy and the need to involve stakeholders and constituencies from throughout the country, not just the coasts and not just these categories. When I was in the Foreign Service, and I'm sure when you all were in it, people thought that dealing with the American public was having former ambassadors go to universities and spend a year talking to classes about their experiences. When in fact, there's a hell of a lot that communities around the country have to offer in terms of the formulation of foreign policy. And if we listened more, we'd probably get greater public support for the policies that we intend to pursue. I have a friend, Anka Lee, who was on our Pete team and who served as the international officer for the California State Legislature, who used to talk to me a lot about China in California and how the Chinese were dealing with state and local officials in ways that they didn't even realize what was taking place. And that this kind of information was so useful, or would be so useful for those who are making China policy, just to listen and hear from those who are dealing with the Chinese in the States and what they're hearing and what they're being told. I think that goes across the board for domestic constituencies everywhere. We've learned it in trade, we've learned it in war, that in order to get support from this country and for our policies, we need to involve this country. Let me ask you one other question though, Gina, with regards to diversity. We have talked so much about diversity over the last couple of years, and certainly over this campaign cycle, that it's almost just becoming a trope. How do you change that from a trope to something that's truly meaningful in terms of training and bringing in those who have not traditionally been in the community of Foreign Service practitioners to those who must be? I mean, I remember when I was in the USIA, there was only one career person who was ever the head of it. And he was the only African American who was ever the head of it. And that was John Reinhardt. Okay. How do we create more people like you and John Reinhardt who want to go into the Foreign Service?
Well, I think a lot of it is, the saying, what is it? If you can see it, you can be it. One of our challenges is that the Department of State does a pretty decent job with recruiting. We send ambassadors in residence or diplomats in residence out to universities that focus on African Americans or Hispanic Americans. We do career fairs and that sort of thing. So, and we've got the fellowship program. So that's the best we do, is at recruiting. The issue becomes retention and promotion. And someone mentioned to me the other day that, as you say, it's becoming so regularized, a trope that people are talking about diversity, that the concern that we often have as you think about how to make change is that you're going to spook our beloved and valued European American males. And how do you make change without upsetting them? I mean, that's the question out there. And so I heard recently that someone said that they were worried in the Department of State that perhaps European American males might be targeted and blocked from any positions, and how unfair this is or going to be. And my response was they should look at the GAO report, because the reality is 83% of senior positions in the Department of State are held by European American men. 83%. So how much is enough? How can you be worried about not having enough when you've got the vast majority of it. And again, that's a important but narrow perspective that's being brought to foreign policy challenges. And the world is not being run by men who originate from Europe any longer. We need different perspectives, different ways of looking at things. As we know as diplomats, the military cannot solve everything. We need to be able to talk. We need people with emotional intelligence and language and cultural understanding and background that comes from having familial connections and knowledge. And that means diversifying and making sure that these people make it all the way up. And so we've got to look at assignments, because assignments are what get you promotions. How is that working? And we know that in the Department of State currently, it can be a very opaque process. Mike, you might not know this, but I know we've all dealt with not getting people we thought were going to be good at our missions, and suddenly somebody else is coming and you're thinking, well, whoa, I looked at all the resumes and I talked to people and, made an informed decision, but somebody else had better contacts. Somebody else had a better rabbi, as we say. And so we've got to make it more transparent so people understand how it works, get that mentorship, understand what I call the invisible furniture in the room that you have to navigate to get those good positions, to ensure that you're in the right place. Women and minorities often don't get that information. And so we're going to have to fix that. And that goes back to the transparency. So I think we've got, there's so much low-hanging fruit, in all honesty. I think we have an excellent chance of making real and sustainable change. But the other half of it is making sure the organization as a whole understands the value of it and understands the value of the people that we're bringing in. Just as we value the people that are here, we have to understand that diversity makes the organization stronger. And we just have to repeat it and repeat it. And, I'm old enough to remember hearing about Alison Palmer. I think we need to have an Alison Palmer award. So many people in the Department of State now don't even know who she is. She's still living, but she's the one who pushed the department when they didn't want to do it, and shame on us, to have women stay in when we got married. Imagine, it was like Star Trek. You got married and suddenly your brain turned to mush, I guess. You couldn't stay in as a diplomat. And she pushed and got that rule changed. So there was a time when women weren't accepted. Well, we've fixed that. We're accepted, we're expected, but we have to be able to get through the career Foreign Service, not just political appointees, make it up and be able to serve at our fullest potential for women, for minorities, our fullest potential. It's good for America.
That is very well said. And I want to thank both of you, Mike and Gina. You guys are fantastic and have shown why you are two of the most respected people in the foreign policy arena today. I thank you for joining us. And as we turn this over, Professor, to you for Q&A, I just want to say one final thing to the family of Chris Stevens. A few weeks ago, the children's author Beverly Cleary passed away. And Judy Bloom, who is an author of a very different genre, put up this tweet. She said on the passing of Beverly Cleary, "I so regret never having met you. You were my inspiration. You will not be forgotten." And so to Jan and Mary and to Carol and Ann and Peter and Tom, Hillary and Lucas, Steve and Sally McDonald and Jennifer, I would say this: I so regret never having met Chris, but he has affected my life and the lives of so many who've served in the Foreign Service. He was an inspiration to us all. He will never be forgotten. Shemin?
Wow. Well, those are powerful words, and thank you all so much for your reflections and contributions. And Doug, I think you said it when you said these are such important questions to ask, and Gina said, yes, they're important and they're really hard. And so, we're grappling with them across so many facets of American life right now, still and belatedly and laboriously. And so thank you all for your contributions to this conversation. And Gina, especially, lots of congratulations in the Q&A as well to you on your new role, which I think, having been at state as well, it's so difficult not to get sucked into putting out, fire after fire, mostly metaphorically, but not always, as you've explained. And so, the good words, the good intentions just don't end up being translated into action. And so I think creating a portfolio for someone to really take ownership is a step in the right direction. And so, Angelique Young was invoked a number of times in this conversation. And so let me start by putting her question to the group, which is, primarily for Gina, but also, of course, everyone should feel free to weigh in. Do you think there could be an intersection or opportunity at the nexus of attracting a more diverse slate of national security professionals and, as Doug suggested, adopting a more risk management oriented approach to development and diplomacy? And how could we make this a moment for not just re-envisioning the workforce internally, but helping the public to see national security work differently?
Yeah, great question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. As I mentioned before, and I think all three of us have made the point about what attracts people to public diplomacy, to public service, and certainly to the State Department. And that is the feeling of wanting to serve, of wanting to make a more peaceful world. And bringing in a more diverse cohort is going to give more options for solutions, different perspectives on recommendations. I know personally, when I've sat in rooms and been the only one, how hard it is to speak up, how hard it is to share my idea if it's not going with the flow, if I've got to put a break on what the discussion is and know that people are going to turn to me and see this brown woman with maybe braided hair and who is she and how did she get in this room? I mean, that's in the back of my head. Even as far as I have come and accomplished in my career, I know still I walk in rooms and people are questioning my right and appropriateness to be in that room. And so I tell people, women in particular, minorities, we have to come with a posse. One person can't make change. You need people there to amplify, to help provide what is now the nomenclature. It's not necessarily that safe space, but that brave space, because our voices and our perspectives are needed. And I recall an incident when I was working at the National Security Council, and we were talking about an issue that I cannot talk about the details of. But from my perspective, the proposals that were going forward were outrageous and wrong for US policy. But nobody else was saying anything. And again, because I felt my aloneness just in my visual, I didn't say anything to stop it, but I did push the decision so that we were going to get together again in a few days. And then I started working the phones afterwards and found two allies, neither of them brown women, but allies. And we were able to get the direction of how the policy discussions were going changed. And so but I knew that they would be allies. And so that is what I'm talking about, that you've got to make sure that people feel empowered enough, brave enough to speak up and redirect, because groupthink can take us, as we know, hysterically into very bad places. And so that gets into that risk. If you're afraid, if you're uncomfortable, if you're feeling alone, it's harder to take risk. If you know you've got an atmosphere that is welcoming of different perspectives, and that is more likely if there is a diverse cohort around the table. It's not that you're all going to agree immediately, but you're going to put things out there and discuss them and think them through and game plan a little bit to see, well, maybe can we do it in a different way? I think it's going to make stronger policy. I think it's going to make better policy. And I think the two absolutely come together.
Mike, you should have a chance to address this.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your new job, Ambassador. It's a really important job. Second, I would just say, I think about this from the perspective of somebody teaching at a university, a pretty good university with the best and the brightest. That phrase was used by others. And how tragic it is that so few of Stanford's students go and work in the State Department. And I think that entry level piece has to be addressed as well. I think the Biden administration, by the way, folks, are showing us that if you say you're going to be committed to diversity, you can do it. This notion that there's not a pipeline and all this kind of excuse me, that's not very ambassadorial. All this kind of, oh, we would have loved to hire that, but there's nobody in the pipeline. They are proving that is incorrect. And that I really want to applaud what they're doing across the table, not just at the State Department, by the way. This is a debate we have in the academy as well about pipeline. They're showing at the top that's not true. But I worry about 22-year-olds. And I think actually I want to be the outsider now. And I want to say the State Department needs to create better incentives for 22-year-olds to join. There are very few places left in the world that you join and 30 years later, you're still in the same organization. Where does that happen? Why is that still the case? Number two, it is really hard, as I learned as ambassador working with FAST officers, it's really hard for partners to have meaningful dual careers in the State Department. You got to blow that up. You got to change that. That is the number one reason that my FAST officers, right, first and second tour officers left, because they wanted to have a family, and the State Department structure made that difficult. And then third, this is a bit orthogonal, but I think it's related. It's part of the earlier discussion about specialization, Doug, that you were talking about. I hesitate here because there's something charming about State Department culture. And by the way, as an outsider, to echo, I want to be clear, I learned so much about so many heroic people in the State Department. I have a radically different view of the State Department today than I did in 2009 when I went to work for Barack Obama in the White House. And by the way, if I didn't understand it as a professor at Stanford, that underscores that we got a lot of work to do in terms of communication, right? But one thing I think has to be addressed, and Ambassador Stevens is on my mind. If you look at his career, he was deeply knowledgeable about the countries he worked in and knowing Arabic, and he structured his career to be a specialist. We spent too much time training. I'm not going to name him, but 2 years of Russian at the Foreign Service Institute. You go out and you go out there, and then you go do 2 more years to learn Mandarin, and then you go over there, and then you leave and you go work for Facebook. This particular gentleman is working for Facebook now. We invested a lot of money in that talent, and then he left. I think we've got to get better at specialization. Communications, computers, Mandarin, Arabic, Farsi, Russian, and it's a balance, right? It's not, we don't want to have people just working on Russia. But I think about it, but here's a very simple way to get it in your mind. I used to play basketball. I still play a little bit of basketball. I used to play basketball in the embassy with some young Marines. And I probably shouldn't have been out there playing with these young Marines. And I broke my finger. You can see it still, right? I did great. I broke my finger. Ended up having surgery here. I regret that because it didn't go so well, as you can see. But, I went and saw a doctor when I broke my finger. And I didn't see a first year or second tour or fourth year rotational person that, had just been working the Iran desk and now was a doctor in Moscow. Of course, our doctors in the State Department have specialization, right? So why don't we treat other domain spaces like that in public affairs too, Doug? Why is there's such a culture of we want to have generalists? And I just think we got to take that on a little bit and then rotate in and out, right? People don't want to spend 30 years in the State Department. They want to spend some time and then go out. And by the way, I think that would be good the other way around. Like, why is it only at the assistant secretary level and the ambassadorial level that we have outsiders come in, but anywhere else lower? No, that would be wrong. I think that mix we could take on, and I think it would make it a much more attractive career for my Stanford students. It does not look like an attractive career choice right now.
I want to just, finish this, man, and pick up on something that Mike said, and actually as a thought for you, Gina, as you go in. There is a pool, I believe, of minority candidates that's out there already. They're just not in government. They're not in the State Department. They are in NGOs. Mm-hmm. They are in activist groups around the country. And in fact, they may be people with the kinds of skills more suited to begin to deal with risk than some others. And we ought to be listening and reaching out to them. We ought to be going to some of the NGOs and some of the African American, Hispanic, Asian American, and others who are working in the field, for groups like the International Crisis Group and Refugees International, and say, we want you in. And here's what we're going to do because you provide skills that we need. We need to look at the cones that we have, including public diplomacy, and say, what kind of skills are missing now that we need to have in order to make sure that the public diplomacy personnel, Mike, who go to the meetings in your Moscow embassy are not the bottom of the totem pole, but in fact are providing information that others can't get because they have the credibility and independence to do the kinds of jobs they need to do. So I think there are talented people. I think we need, with regard to the HBCUs, Gina, not just to go and talk to their classes, but to make sure they get internships, and not just in embassies, but with NGOs, so that they are on the ground and learning and listening. Because we've seen, in terms of some of the activism that we've seen over the last years, that these are extremely intelligent people, and they're passionate people, and they're passionate about their country, and they're passionate about the values. And if we look at them in that way, I think there's an opportunity to have a dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Well, it pains me to have to sign off on all of our behalfs, because I know we could go on for a very long time, but we've been asked to close around now. I just wanted to give thanks to those of you who submitted questions that we weren't able to get to, a shout out to another pioneering woman who's in the Q&A, Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor, for being part of this.
Congratulations to you, Gina. And a couple of questions, again, about both ambassadorships and career and political paths to the State Department. So we will all keep an eye out for writing and blogging. A couple of links I know in the chat to things that Mike McFaul has written, the Truman Report that was referenced, the wonderful blog post on just security that Doug Wilson and his co-authors posted a few months ago. We will also be posting a link to this video on just security, and really look forward to everyone continuing the conversation, and for a great turnout today. Hopefully you've got a lot of new recruits as a result of this invigorating conversation. So thank you so much to the Stevens family and to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.